Good afternoon. How are you? Hope you've had a great day. I was going to say it's Good Friday, but it's not Friday today. It's Wednesday. Don't always know what day of the week it is at the moment. But today you join us on Slingshot Speaks Isolation Creatives as we are about to chat to the fabulous Tyne O'Connell, the LGBTQ historian and author. So we're going to hear about her stories, her journey, and how she came to doing what she does, where she draws her inspiration, where she gets her passion for a fountain of knowledge, and has so much insight. Hello, darling.
I'm just
You looking fabulous.
Thank you, darling.
What a fabulous backdrop. I look very boring now with my white backdrop.
In bed.
It looks fabulous. You're looking very glamorous and gorgeous. So thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Every so often. That would
So we have the great privilege of chatting with you today, and this series has been fabulous in that we've been able to hear so many stories and journeys from so many amazing creatives, and I think that I think today there's a lot of people that are looking forward to hearing more about your story and journey and your passion and insight and drive for all things history. So I think maybe let's start with talking about, I guess, how you ended up being an LGBTQ historian. I mean, tell me about the bit before this. Like, tell me where this passion and drive came from, and I guess, has it always been something that's driven you and interested you?
It has always driven me. As you know, you probably know, Quentin Crisp. My father knew Quentin Crisp, and I was very inspired by him as a child because he was, I don't know, we just had a very close connection.
Yeah.
I was very pleased that my daughter was able to get to know him as well, although she doesn't really remember, but she did have that opportunity. He really shaped a lot of my life, probably as much as my mother, father, and the nuns, the extraordinary nuns that educated me. I had a very unusual sort of, let's say, a very liberal upbringing in terms of ideas. And
Yeah.
So my Quentin Crisp told me when I was young and confused and uncertain of how the world worked and what my place in it would be, then he said, all you have to worry about is being interesting. Make yourself as interesting as you possibly can. There's nothing more awful than being uninteresting. As you have a debt to your biographer to make your life as interesting as you possibly can. Now that really, on one hand I thought, well, I don't know what a biographer is, I don't have a biographer. It did give me a guiding. It was sort of like a lamp in front of me, like he was like my boy. Make myself interesting. Just my mother, on the other hand, backed that by saying, when I said to her, I was worried about how I'd be perceived in certain situations, I was very shy, she said, as if anyone would be looking about you. Look at you. People are more interested in what's going on in their own minds. They're not focused on you. You are not the focus of the world or anybody. And I said, well, what about when I'm on stage and there's no one else on the stage and I have to deliver a soliloquy? She said, people will be thinking about whether they left the gas on. They'll be thinking about the chores they have to do tomorrow. They'll be thinking about the book they're reading. People don't think very much about people. She said, I certainly don't, and I believe that to be true. And so I grew up believing I wasn't being judged, and Quentin telling me I had an obligation to be interesting. And of course, he was interesting. He fascinated me. He was just completely himself. Although he told me that had he been born in a different age, he would have been a woman.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting that you say that you had from home, you had that. I mean, do you consider it a lack of encouragement, or was it more realism? Do you think that from your mother that that was kind of her way of trying to ground you, or was it?
Way of both making sure that I was me, not
Yeah,
shaping myself according to fit other people's ideas of what I should be, not
yeah,
trying to conform. That to her was the worst thing you could do. You know, I come from a
yeah,
long line of subversive women going back through history, and they're about as subversive as you can get. Certainly, you know, I had lesbian aunts, and I was exposed to a very different world, certainly a non-conformist world. And
yeah,
I had a lot of eccentric relatives who were plain extraordinary, really. But I could see if I had had a different mother, I might have judged them. Perhaps, I don't know. But
so I mean,
I certainly didn't. My mother was anxious that I didn't shape myself to fit in. She thought
yeah,
society was a mess. She didn't trust systems. She didn't trust bureaucracy. She didn't trust authority. She didn't trust men. And she thought the whole valley system needed changing. And so she certainly didn't want me to conform to what a girl should
yeah,
be. She
yeah,
wouldn't
which is great advice. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
until I was.
I mean, I think it's interesting, though, isn't it? Because we could probably do with some of there's probably quite a few people that could do with that thinking right now. You know, it's kind of feels even more relevant, maybe that ideology of, you know, the systems needing changing and things being a little bit, maybe not quite as perfect as they could be. But so, I mean, because I think it's interesting, isn't it? That kind of the steer and the nature nurture that we have early on either has an impact in that it kind of drives us to go the opposite, or it encourages to go a certain way. But I guess for you, if you had that from home, which kind of kept you very real, which I think, you know, that whole idea of encouraging your daughter not to conform is definitely something that I endeavour to do with my daughter, who's only 10 at the moment. But then the idea that you were told that you weren't going to be the focus and that it was going to be very, I guess, diffused, and that that you wouldn't maybe have any of the limelight. And it's almost that the two things coming together that almost, but then having the input from Quentin was almost that other side of the.
Both coming from the same place, as in, don't try and fit in because you
Yeah,
can't try, and don't worry about what other people think about you. Whatever, you know, people often project onto other people ideas which the subject has no idea how they arrived at that
yeah,
conclusion. So you really, it's you're on a hiding to nothing if you
yeah,
attempt to try and fit in, or you
yeah,
attempt to be something, even if you attempt to be different. By being interesting, Quentin Crisp was quite clear that he was saying, be interested, like,
yeah,
find your passion. He told me that it was my obligation to rewrite. When I told him, I knew at a very early age that I wanted to be an author, that I wanted to write. I was obsessed with books. I disappeared into books, into other worlds,
yeah,
and I found the reality I found in literature and history as real as the life going on around me, and oftentimes far more appealing.
yeah,
And when I was reading, he gave me Edith Sitwell's book to read, British Eccentrics. Now, he knew her, and he was not fond of her, and he loathed the book. Now, he said to me, when I told him, he said, what do you think you'll do when you're an adult? Do you have any ideas? And I said, well, I think I'll be an author. And he said, well, if you're going to start writing, it's very important. You must write the story of British eccentrics, because I think he was probably a bit miffed he wasn't in it. But he said, you know, more boring than conservative, more conformist bunch of nobodies and no-hopers I've yet to read about. He said,
Yeah.
you know, honestly, you know, that you have to write that book. Write about history. Write about the real eccentrics. Don't write about the people who, you know, the British eccentrics sort of type who have their horse in to have tea with. Write about people who took risks, who lived lives that they were persecuted for and yet lived them anyway, because they're the people after all. And this is what I discovered. When I was struggling, throughout my life I struggled with 3 children to give them a good education. I believed that was the source of everything, because coming a long line of on my mother's side, dirt poor poverty, on my father's side, Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator and landed gentry, so in Ireland. But even Daniel O'Connell, although he, you know, was born in a grand house, he was brought up in the Irish chieftain tradition, which is the richest people sent their children to be brought up and educated by the poorest family in the parish. And that was because when you grew up, they were your, of course, it served him well as a barrister and as a voice for supporting the abolition of slavery. He understood poverty because he had grown up in poverty. He had grown up, he knew what it felt like to go to bed hungry without enough food in your belly. So he knew what it was like to be so hungry that you ate dirt just to put something in your belly, which is where the saying dirt poor.
It sounds like something that maybe some of our current politicians could maybe do with going through that process and having more of an understanding maybe of both sides. It sounds like not a bad philosophy of how to understand how the other people live, isn't it? It's
array of people. I mean, LGBTQIA, not that they're a community or anything, but just in the sense of growing up different, growing up knowing that you don't conform. It should be celebrated. And when politics try to do something about it, they inevitably, get it wrong, and they treat them like, they're the other, like they're other, community, a separate community, right? Or just like women, when they deal with women's issues, they treat women like the other. That, you're a community, and you're all the same, and what you want, or this is what we're going to give you, this is what you need. We understand. Here you do, this is what we're going to give you because this is what you need, and it's inevitably everyone has different needs. We're individuals, we're not. I don't identify myself as anything other than myself. I often felt growing up I had more in common with the hens that I looked after than I did with people. I often felt trees, often sit in trees, feel I wish I could sit in a tree. But looking back through history, it is unequivocally true that the torchbearers of history were subversive, LGBTQIA, and in the 1700s, certainly as more Africans made their home in Britain in the 18th century, Black Britain's contribution to British culture and customs, they're everywhere in plain sight, and yet nobody knows their names. And I think this is why it's so important to understand history, because we are doomed to the same errors as we have done. And at the moment, we are really in a period of time in which we are facing the same problems as people faced in the first half of the 17th century, 1603 to 1640, in which the modern age, the scientific revolution, the Baroque, all this was going on. The people spearheading it, the torchbearers, people at the centre of it, were not straight white men. None of them were. Not even one. Even the king, the top of the pile, was openly gay, and had to stand before the Privy Council, in fact, on it in 1618 and account for his, behaviour, and calling another man his wife, and kissing and tumbling him as if he were his. So the reason that, so while all this wonderful stuff was happening and we were going forward, we had a silk industry, a glass industry, we were the greatest producer of domestic glass, we had conservation laws prohibiting factories from chopping down trees, forcing them to source other materials, and it was a very interesting period of history in that they faced many of the same problems. 80% of the forests had been chopped down. There was people were suffering from the plague. There was still a lot of medieval superstition that created a brutality at every level of society that is quite similar to what we're experiencing.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? We're looking. People say that we're kind of at a period of reflection and looking back, but it you know, from even just some of the things of learning from you, that but we're maybe just not looking far enough back. You know, we're just looking within the century rather than looking to other centuries. And as you were just saying earlier, of, you know, people trying to be like each other, and I think that's part of the problem, isn't it? Now you know, that whole idea of be interesting, people focus so much about being followed rather than being interesting, and they focus on happiness rather than a sense of purpose.
Well, to be interested, no one is interesting who's obsessed with themselves. That's the last way that you're going to attract anybody to notice you. Being interested in ideas, in people, it makes a person interesting. The magnificent thing for me about being given past this torch by Quentin Crisp, by being told you need to do this, you need to uncover the true history of eccentricity. I relied only on source materials, and I went all the way back through history, and fortunately I have Latin and a little bit of Greek, and I discovered that everything changed in Britain in 1603. There was an alignment of certain factors, but what happened, very situation today, it was the Baroque had started officially in 1600 with opera, celebration of all the arts. What happened in Britain now? In Wilton House, which is in Salisbury, a woman called Mary Hermit, a Countess of Pembroke, opened up, like they had in France and other parts of Europe, about culture, discuss culture and ideas. But instead of restricting it to other aristocrats, she opened it up to people, all, regardless. There were no barriers of class, no barriers of gender, no barriers of race, no barriers of sexuality. And here we find Shakespeare, here we find Francis Bacon, here we find Mary Roth, here we find Elizabeth Harry. Now, Shakespeare, he shared the same lover as Mary Roth, William Herbert, her son. So she was able to write to her son and said, can you get Shakespeare here? Because I need to get the king who's on his way down, the new king after Elizabeth's death. I need to get King James VI of Scotland, who was now James I of all four, the first king to rule over all kingdoms, Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland. I need to get him here because I need to stop them beheading Sir Walter Raleigh. Because he was about to be beheaded. So, Shakespeare, she knew that he would be with his lover, so he did. And so there's a letter which is missing, but there's references throughout history. The last reference was in the 1800s. The head of Eton had the letter, and he refers to the letter and quotes from the letter. And one of the things she wrote to her husband with the king, tell him I have the man Shakespeare here. She had everybody. She had everybody. She was imprisoned during, in and out of prison like all playwrights during Elizabeth's era. She didn't like the theatre. All the ideas that an Elizabethan playwright, all made up, all fantasy, like so much of history. Just like the idea that black people were sitting on their hands and Africans in Britain, of whom there are about 10,000 in the 1700s, were just sitting on their hands doing nothing, which really grinds my gears. And the idea of women, African Britons, and LGBTQs were all either in the club or doing absolutely nothing. They weren't. They were the people doing things. They were the people making things happen, because they needed things to happen. They needed to affect change. And
but do you think, though, that that, as you've said, that so much of the activity and the drive was from the LGBTQI people in history, and it wasn't any white middle class men as it is now?
No.
I mean, do you, as you say, do you think that it's partly one that they that they have to stand up in the same way as we're still fighting, people are still fighting now? Was it that drive that they already knew they're a bit different and they were trying to make their way, or is it coincidence, or is it that kind of drive of being different that gave them the strength, in a way, almost the opposite that it's happening now? It's the strength that was driving.
Coincidence. I think they needed to affect change. They were in a position where it was do or die for them. And remember, there was no word for gay people. There was no word for transgender. I mean, we didn't get a word for transgenderism until 86. So I grew up amongst transgender friends of the family, and there was no word. They were just accepted as whatever gender they presented themselves of.
Do you think that as soon as we put labels on things, and that people feel that they need to identify as one thing or another in general, not just about gender or sexuality, do you think that it's sometimes that labeling that causes some of the problems between different groups, or I mean, do you think that, as you say, before in history, when it was just accepted that people were who they were, and that there weren't words for different types of people?
Interesting to this specific period. Remember, there was no racism. There was class issues were the big
Coming from
the aristocracy, if you were a black king, you were more important than a white gentry. Yes, you were. So when, in fact, when James's coronation took place, African kings, Ghana, and they married into, Queen Marguerite, Queen Charlotte, Queen Margaret, she of Scotland, she was from Ghana, and she this in the 1500s, and her great I think it's 5 generations down, Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George the Third. She had African features, and she looked more African than you would imagine, unless you look at specific portraits of her. Then, oh my God, she's clearly from Ghana. And she was also a Salonea. But this is, she's almost 200 years after the period I'm speaking about, when there was an opportunity for people to live as individuals. Because look at the word eccentricity for a start. Back then, it came out of the Scientific Revolution into language. It refers to the deviation of a planet planets make a circular orbit. But they're not. It's not always a completely circular orbit. The ellipse is often, oval shaped, slightly off, and that measurement, the degrees from which it deviates, is called eccentricity. The measurement is eccentricity, and this is what eccentric meant originally. Now, words like and Dan Dezet, and they were all brought about by Puritans to label in a derogatory manner men who dressed as women. This was the biggest argument and debate going on in the 60s, in the first part of the 1800s, the first 10 years and the second 10 years. Really, it was what caused the Civil War, because let's face it, Cromwell was no fan, or nor the Puritans wanted democracy. People didn't even want democracy in Victorian's age. Remember that. Democracy, we love it, we think it's ideal, but they saw it as mob rule. And the only people who could vote, I mean, remember, Britain didn't get the vote until, well, the first African to vote was 1774. He could have voted earlier, but he refused to have the house in his name, the book in his name, because he would have the house for a nice waistcoat on Savile Row. And it's very interesting to recognise that back then there was no racism, and this is important because it meant that racism, the first reference of black people in any way being inferior to white people intellectually, came about in 1704, and Immanuel Kant was the driving force of it. Now, he was one of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, which was not such an enlightening period as you might think. It's where we decided it might be a good idea, an idea which we had resolutely learned since Cromwell. He's called the father of European fascism, the father of fascism, Oliver Cromwell, because, of course, in 1648, he had General Pride tried Parliament. They removed 307 who were not Puritans. We don't know what happened to them. They didn't return. And of those 200, he still couldn't get a democratic vote to chop off the king's head. So he got rid of Parliament altogether and ruled with a rump Parliament, the Parliament of Saints, none of whom were elected by anybody, not even the aristocracy, not even the landed gentry. They were just, cronies, Puritan cronies who had very hard-line views, and so they banned fashion, banned makeup, women had to walk behind men, they carried out ethnic cleansing on Celts. Now that's, Celts had been considered subhuman earlier. Celts had been considered subhuman long before, and the Celts include the Scots, some Scots and some and all Irish. So they were subhuman first, and they were put into slavery long before Europeans started using black slavery. They were using slaves. And
but do you think, Tyne, just because obviously with all the conversations that we're having in the world at the moment, and obviously all the conversations around Black Lives Matter at the moment, all of the conversations that are coming up through the political situation at the moment, with COVID, with all of the different things that we're dealing with as a world at the moment. I mean, you're talking at the moment about the 1600s, 1700s. I mean, there's some of the topics and themes are not dissimilar, are they? And we've moved.
Well, I hope that what happened in 1641 does not happen now. We were going forward. In fact, the 1630s referred to as the halcyon years. We were going forward, as in there was no famine. Everyone had enough tea, which was the first time in history. Everyone, and you can say that's not a big deal. In fact, if you've ever gone to bed at night after night after night, it's a big deal. Having enough is a very good thing. There was theatre for everyone. We had 17 theatres in London in 1610, and in 1670 we had 2. So, and we had twice, much bigger population. So, but yes, we had ethnic and moral cleansing. That Cromwell, the Puritans, they believed that the arts, when I say pleasure, I mean anything that makes you happy, whether it's kicking a ball around with your child, or having a drink, or going to the theatre or the opera, or dancing, going to knees up, whatever your idea of fun is, it was banned. And pleasure was evil. They believed it to be the three, so pleasure, the arts, and and new ideas were three prongs of Satan's trident. So they want change. They wanted to drag us back to Old Testament. They wanted people to live in the Old Testament way so the rapture could happen. They believed the second coming would happen in 1666. And they believed it so that they place and everyone had to be reborn in the congregation of the firstborn, it was called, the Puritans. They didn't call themselves Puritans, they called themselves the godly. But the situation is so similar, and what I'm afraid of is if we don't seize this moment to affect change or all the changes that people are fighting for, we need to celebrate those. We need to make it like a good time. We need to sell it as a good idea, because it is a good idea. We need change. These are broken. People, a society, as Francis Bacon wrote in New Atlantis, is only as great as its poorest, as whoever's suffering the most, and that is how rich the society is. If anybody is struggling, be it because of their economic situation, I mean, the color of their skin pigment, or their sexuality, or anything. It is an appalling idea. It breaks anyone's heart. Anyone's.
I mean, I think though that change doesn't happen when people are comfortable, does it? It happens when there's challenge, as we are now. And as you say, it is, and we talk about it on a, not lighter level, on different levels through all these different lives we've had. And this is, for small businesses, for creatives, for the world, for the politics, for economic, it is an exciting time, as you said, it is. And if we use it and seize it and really take this opportunity, personally, collectively, globally, to actually make an impact, it can be really powerful. And it takes something like this for those kind of changes to happen, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I also think, though, that these are everyone who recognizes change is important. In all the areas, the environment, bigotry against anybody's lifestyle choice or skin pigment or gender, anything, bigotry, the environment, the police. I mean, I think the whole structure of society is backward. I think the fact that children are still being robbed of their Black and LGBTQIA heroines and heroes makes me so frustrated. That so history was rewritten in 1845 by a group of self-proclaimed white supremacists who, let's take Sir Thomas Carlyle, who rewrote history, creating Shakespeare as a figure of the Elizabethan rather than a figure of the Shakespearean, which is what he was. There's no escaping that fact. You only have to look at the Stationers' Register to see that any plays he wrote before then were stayed, which meant not allowed. So they rewrote history, placing Shakespeare and also removing the gay themes. And why are we still using a Victorian viewpoint of Shakespeare? I mean, the director of the Shakespeare Company has gone on record as saying that he wants to change that. As You Like It is a play celebrating LGBTQIA themes. And the fact that in Hamlet, we've got a gay couple being a couple of chaps who are just, matey with one another. And anyway, he rewrote history completely. He rewrote history, and Macaulay joined him. They did it because of what was happening in another part of society where people were openly, there was a more open. Let's look at the main play that had seen out the last century, Oronuku, about slavery. The dance music that everyone was dancing to at Almack's and all over the empire was Ignatius Sancho, who was born on an African slave ship, and when he was born, his father slit his own throat at the horror that he would have his son would see him grow up a slave, his father a slave. And he wrote about these themes in the last few years, but most of his life was spent writing volumes of music and sheets of music, which he published in his own press on Charles Street, Mayfair. It doesn't exist anymore, so they put a plaque up to him on Charles Street, Westminster, where the Montague family were his patrons. But he himself lived where Oscar Wilde lived when he came to London after Oxford, on Charles Street, which was now Carlos Place, when they created Mount Street, turned the graveyard of St. into Mount Street Gardens. Charles Street disappeared, but he ran a store that sold music and sugar and tobacco and whatnot. And it was a man of letters, celebrated man of letters in his own day. He was part of salon culture in Mayfair, attending the salons of Dorothy Savile and of Elizabeth Montagu. And his music was the music that he not only wrote music, but he wrote the dance steps. So everybody knew him, and he marketed himself across the empire. People of every colour were dancing to his tune, and I think that must have given him and his other Black British friends a great deal of the irony would not have escaped them. He did suffer some bigotry, but not at the extent that we see arising in the latter half of the 1800s. He was walking down a passage in Westminster, Spring Passage, and a couple of dandies approached him, and they said, "Ah, smoke Othello," and he stood up to them. He was a portly little dandy with his brilliantly coloured, expensive waistcoat, and he had a sonorial, great voice because he acted on the stage. His friend David Garrett plays playing non-white roles, as well as yes, he did play Othello. But he said, "I, Othello, such Othellos as I, such bigots as you, one can meet in any London alleyway, sir."
And have we changed? Has it changed? That's the problem, isn't it? How far are we on? And people are still experiencing. So let me ask you, Ty. The amount of knowledge that you have of such periods of history. You said that in the beginning that obviously your conversations with Quentin drove that idea of wanting to be interested and interesting, but I mean it's quite a volume of information that you retain.
Yes.
I mean, what is it, do you think, that, I mean, obviously he advised you to stay interesting and interested, but that doesn't mean that you are necessarily able to physically retain that amount of information. What do you think is it that gives you that continued appetite and retention of information and detail that you have as a person, as a creative?
Memory and emotion. We remember things that make us feel. So man forgets. They used to say scientists said that when they discovered this, that a man might forget his wedding anniversary, but he won't forget the first dance, the first kiss, the first walk. He will remember the things that spark his imagination. Where Oh, this is different now, of course. I'm talking about, you know, stereotype from when they've discovered that memory and emotion are connected together.
Yeah.
Right? We remember things that we care about. That's why often you might sit with someone very elderly and they don't remember. My father didn't realize I was his daughter. He tried to chat me up. And,
Yeah.
you know, my mother said, "That's your daughter." And very pretty, very, very pretty too. And, but he could remember in detail his.
Yeah.
And that's where I got a lot of his most exciting stories of Quentin, stories which Quentin himself had been too shy to reveal to me as his goddaughter. And because they met, you know, in the war, and he always said that Quentin was the bravest man he ever met. My father was higher. He flew in the RAF. He flew planes higher than any other. He flew the latest Spitfires, the latest whatever. He flew every sort of plane. But he, as a St. George, the King George's Cross, which Quentin didn't get, and he felt my father actually campaigned for him to receive it. As other, when he went through balls at the palace, or you know, the Ritz, they put on a good show for the leading pilots, and he would see Quentin running as the bombs were falling, walking through Mayfair, the bombs coming down, and he would see and Chris running into the and as everyone else was running out and running for the shelter, running into buildings, and nothing stopped him. He just kept on running when other people said, "No man, stop, it's too much now." And he would save kittens. You know, he just was an incredibly, his bravery was endless. My father said he had never seen such bravery, and he saw a lot of people in the war, obviously. He was, you know, when he told me the stories of Quentin, he would tear up. He was so moved by them. They'd known one another as acquaintances through Nancy Mitford's bookshop on Curzon Street, which is still there, Hayward Hill, and my son had his wedding register there for that reason to honor. And Nancy used to have a burner going, and she'd make tea. There was always a pot of tea on the boil, and it was place for people such as Quentin Crisp, even more Edith Sitwell, people who a man like Quentin from his background would not have met, but he was part of that group. My father met him when an American serviceman grabbed him and said, "Hey, buddy, can you show me where the underground is?" My father was in white and he was going to a ball at Buckingham Palace, and he remembers it vividly. So he tried to get this fellow to the underground, but he was in a real state. He was paralyzed with stress. He couldn't manage it on his own. And Quentin Crisp assisted him, and the two of them had to carry him to the underground. And he said, "Aren't you guys, aren't you coming in to, you know, because the bombs are falling?" And
but do you think, Tyke, so for you, you said that you that the idea of your memory is very triggered by things that give you a feeling, that make you feel something. Do you think that, I mean, yeah, is it
I was these things.
Sorry?
As a child, what mattered to me most was animals, trees, the environment. And we were all asked to do a composition when I was 9. We were asked to do a composition saying what we believed 2000 the world would look like in 2000. And I wrote, people would be horrified that we chopped down trees. People would be horrified that we were unkind to people who were different. And then in brackets, lists a whole lot of people who were unkind. It was a vast list, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
And people will be shocked that people were hungry, and people will be shocked that people were selfish, that some people were very wealthy and some people were very poor, and that people will be shocked that children were beaten. And I was hit as So that was a dig at my own mother.
Yeah, yeah.
And apologized for hitting me afterwards. But yeah, it was very
But if you,
the same things, exactly the same things matter to me.
yeah. Do you, obviously for you, spending a lot of time understanding and I guess rationalizing or trying to depict different periods from history, for you on a sort of general basis, obviously it's your work and it's become your writing as well, but do you use those moments in history to drive sort of future and ideas for future, or for you is it very much understanding the past still gives those feelings and moments, but is there how much of a disconnection or connection is there for you as far as what's next versus what's been?
It's a really brilliant question, because I really have been affected by recent events. I have a in my hypothalamus, and that means that I feel, when I have a feeling, it's expressed physically. So everyone who has ever been so frightened they sweat and they vomit, these sorts of things, I'm like the smallest amount of upset. I can't read the news, but my friends tell me what's going on, from Instagram, and it affects me physically. It distresses me to the point where my body feels it, and I just, a vision comes to my mind. I feel physically, I'm sweating already. I feel nauseous, but I do celebrate the ideas that people are expressing at the moment. I celebrate those ideas, and that gives me hope. I really believe that in the last, since really the 1800s, middle 1800s, things really began to go downhill after my ancestor Daniel O'Connell had slavery abolished across the empire, and then focused on slavery in America. People were angry about the loss of income. He is the reason that the people who were compensated for keeping slaves, he's the reason their names are published. He called it name them and shame them, and he got that bill passed so that if you want to know who kept slaves, pages of names, and it tells you the numbers of slaves, where they were, and who those people were. So that record exists because they tried to stop that.
I'm sure.
He just finished paying off that ridiculous scene debt, but that's when society recoiled against and started arguing for the reintroduction of slavery. Bigotry increased. The bigotry against women increased. Bigotry against anyone different, and they only pulled back after the trial of Oscar Wilde. It's interesting. This is a big hallmark in history. It's a big key date, because after Oscar Wilde was released from prison, that's when the word homosexual came about, and it's when society began to turn away from its relentless pursuit and hounding of people who didn't conform to the straight white, which is a very narrow society. Let's be clear, we're about a tiny percent of the population. They recognized themselves they'd gone too far. The Marquis of Queensberry tried to stop the libel trial, even though it was Lord Pasquale. He tried to stop it because he stopped his own barrister. He said, that's enough now, you're going too far, you're destroying this man publicly, this is too much. He became upset, and it destroyed all their lives, all three players in that. And he went to the judge, and the judge said, no, it's too late, it's now a matter for the police. And he was arrested in Chelsea. He was arrested in his flat.
But does you said that the events affect you physically, obviously because of your illness at the moment. Do you feel the same impact from the distressing moments in history, or more just those that are going to impact the future?
Yes, and that's why I really strongly feel that it's important. I can't express how strongly I feel it, that it's important that we celebrate the ideas, the progressive ideas that we are struggling to bring into reality now.
Yeah.
We need to see them. It's an opportunity for everybody, not just the people that they benefit. This is where I think people have got it wrong. I think that the people who are fighting against these wonderful changes, it would benefit them. We are all enriched by an open society that is fair, equitable, just, and honest. But I do believe that part of gaining this society is that we undo the revisionist history, because history was rewritten in the 1840s, 60s. Yes, it was rewritten using a Calvinist heteronormative historiography, which means a template in which, so the example is Frederick the Great. He was gay and an absolute bastard. Saddest. He was not a nice man. The fact that he was gay is neither here nor there. But to be a great man, so history was rewritten to create a heroic of great men. And that's what Herodotus said. History is the story of great men, not the story of great women. And it became, in the 1840s onwards, it became the story of great white men. And this is key. So Frederick the Great, McCall is gay, so he can't be a great man. And everything he did. Where Thomas Carlyle was, I think he should be ripped of his knighthood. He he said he wasn't gay, that's just a terrible, nasty. He was a great sadist. He was a white supremacist. How dare you? By the way, just the person who really generated the driving force behind this straight, white, great, heroic narrative of great men was driven by a Thomas Carlyle, a white supremacist, whose, you might like to read his 94 pages called Occasional Discourse on the End Question. I'm not going to use the word. It's just so appalling and that that man has a knighthood. He really campaigned for the reintroduction of slavery, and he said, in the meantime, let's use Celts.
It feels that it feels time like we should be doing this as like a little monthly slot, because we've not even touched the sides, have we? There's so much more to chat about, and we've only got a couple more.
It's important to give everybody back. So they're heroes and heroines. They've been removed from history, or they've been made straight, rendered straight, or achievements diminished. So Ignatius Sancho is only celebrated for the 4. I'm not taking anything from his abolitionist letters. They're fabulous. They really are what getting rid of slavery around the empire. But his great achievement was his music and his choreography. Let's think about Amo, the philosopher, Antonius Amo, the African-German philosopher, because he and a campaign of bigotry driven by Kant, funded by Kant. He paid playwrights to write plays depicting Africans as subhuman and idiots, and their brains made awful things, and he hounded him out of Germany. Now his father, Amo's father, is such an awful story, because if you want to read his philosophy, it's so enlightening. It's the greatest work.
Fine. I don't want to cut you off there, but we've literally got a couple more minutes, and I just want to make sure that we so just tell us, you've got a book. Just get us a little plug for what you've got. And I feel like we need to do another live together, because there's so much more to talk about. This hour has just gone so quickly.
Sorry, I get too passionate, because I just wish.
No.
I wish.
Do you know what? It's fascinating, and It's
of history. It's like we have a black and white history, and they've
yeah,
posted all the women, LGBTQ, and non-Anglo-Saxons from it, and it's just so nuts that they've done it, and nothing's been addressed it, even though people in the last 20 years have increased of doctorates, nothing major has been done to overhaul it. That's what my book does. It started off that Quentin asked me to write. It's turned into something much more. It's his history book, and I'm going to be sending it out soon, because I redrafted it since what's happened, because I see it's really, I can see so many all the parallels.
well,
You could just take a template and put it over the top of the early decades of the 1600s, and you have exactly the same situation in people on the
crazy,
street.
isn't it?
Puritan.
Crazy. Well, I think let's book in another slot to continue this. Let's rewrite it. Let's get them. Yeah, I think there's maybe a part 2 to come on another day. If you're up for it, I think this is the beginning. But thank you so much for your time. You are such an amazing lady with such a vast knowledge of so many periods that we have so much to learn from, and you're an inspiration. So thank you so much for your time today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Lovely.
If anyone's missed any of it, the whole interview will be on the grid, on Slingshot Grid. So do listen to the whole thing, but maybe watch this space. There might be a part 2 at some point.
Thank you, Zoe, and it's really been such a wonderful privilege for me to be asked questions. I mean, I'm bedbound a lot of the time, and it is what's happening now. I really hope that it's being fueled by such a pain, and it's important that we see it through, because everybody will be a winner, and I just think that it's important to keep that in mind, and in some way do something as individuals to support the issues are are on the table to address, because unfortunately most politicians aren't addressing them, or even trying to. So they're sort of like token efforts, because we can all do something. We might think that we can't.
We can, yeah. Well, I think this is the point, isn't it? I mean, I think for us with this whole series of lives, it's really starting to have some conversations about various topics that we can all share in, and then you have to have the conversation. Sometimes they're a bit more challenging, and sometimes we have to push out of our comfort zones to actually make a change, don't we? And actually
the changes have been from very painful areas. They're solved for everybody, really. They should be solved, because if someone's painful, empathy is the basic human condition. If you don't have empathy, you've got some issues. If someone's in pain, I'm in pain. I'm in fact replicating it, I physically feel it. I cannot bear it, or an animal, or a tree. The point is people are saying it's the end of fashion. I'm saying no, it's the beginning of fashion. They're saying everything's the end. It's negative light, everything that's happening. Police. Well, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe we need to rebuild something. I'm not saying I don't know what the answers are. I'm not a think tank, but I do see when so many people are saying it's broken, it's probably broken. And we need to be positive about getting these changes through. It's the beginning of fashion, and fashion was born in 1604, and it survived a lot. The fact that it's going to change is surely what fashion's about in the first place.
Absolutely, I think stronger together, and it's just about us all trying to have an impact, isn't it? And as you say, there is an exciting future. It's just that it's a different time than we know now, but in a good way. So thank you so much.
Just try and understand it. That's when people opinions, you know, they're negative about someone's viewpoint. I say, well, if they're in pain, just at least try and understand why they're upset about these things, because
Yeah.
you can't.
Thank you so much, Time.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, darling. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everyone for listening.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Zoe.